the agony.
Apply more pressure.
What if your body began to rot before you died? What if you, the most powerful monarch in the world, lay helpless in your royal bed as worms burrowed into your wounds, as your flesh sloughed away in strips, and as every breath you took was saturated with the scent of your own decay? This is not a fable. This is not a medieval horror tale. This is the death documented, witnessed, recorded in painful, excruciating detail of King Philip II of Spain, the man who ruled the vast Spanish Empire, whose authority stretched from the icy ports of the Netherlands to the golden mines of Peru, from the bustling markets of Manila to the cathedrals of Castile, died in a way that no ruler, no commoner, no creature should ever endure, for 53 days in the summer of the year 1598. This king, whose reign had spanned over 4 decades, was locked in a body that refused to die, but no longer lived. His skin split, his wounds deepened, his room filled with incense, prayers, and the stench of rotting human flesh. And through it all, he remained awake, aware, and wholly human. Philip was born in the year 1527 into the most powerful dynasty Europe had ever seen. His father, Charles V, ruled the Holy Roman Empire, and from him, Philip inherited a realm so immense, it was said that the sun never set on its lands. He was raised not merely to be a king, but to be a divine instrument, chosen by God to defend the Catholic faith and preserve order in a fractured Europe. By the time he reached maturity, he ruled over Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, the Spanish Netherlands, and the vast colonial territories in the Americas and Asia. He constructed the mighty El Escorial Palace Monastery as both a fortress of faith and a monument to his imperial authority. He micromanaged his empire from his desk, reading thousands of documents, issuing commands down to the smallest detail. He did not trust easily. He delegated little. His control was total, until the very thing he could not command began to revolt against him, his body. By the time he entered his 70s, Philip was no longer the lean, sharp-eyed monarch of earlier portraits. His joints were gnarled with gout, an agonizing condition that made walking or even sitting painful. His abdomen swelled with dropsy, and his legs ballooned grotesquely. The signs were there. His body was whispering the first notes of rebellion, but no one, not his physicians, not his priests, and certainly not the king himself, could have predicted the symphony of suffering that was to follow. In the spring of 1598, he developed a fever, likely malaria, which struck with waves of sweat and chills. His physicians diagnosed it as a minor illness. They applied the expected remedies: bleeding, purging, herbal poultice. But then the lesions began. At first, they were thought to be bed sores, an unfortunate side effect of prolonged immobility. Yet these wounds did not heal. They deepened, they darkened, they multiplied. The king's back, sides, and thighs began to resemble a battlefield. Layers of flesh peeled back, and beneath them, infection festered. It was late July when someone noticed movement: faint, wriggling, pulsing movement within the open wounds. These were not twitches of nerves. These were not signs of healing. These were larvae, maggots, living creatures, born from flies attracted to the festering rot, now feeding on the flesh of a man still alive. The King of Spain, the defender of Christendom, had become host to carrion feeders. From that moment on, The story stopped being about medicine and became about horror. Physicians could do nothing but change the dressings, remove the maggots with metal tweezers, and hope the king would die before his body was entirely consumed. But he did not die. He remained conscious, praying, bleeding, retching. The wounds widened. The pus poured. The smell, described in multiple accounts as unbearable, permeated the stone walls of El Escorial, spreading like a curse. The servants who bathed him gagged. The priests who read scripture at his bedside soaked cloths in vinegar and pressed them to their faces. Incense was burned in cauldrons. Nothing could mask it. The rot was alive. Despite everything, Philip remained king. He still signed documents. He still issued decrees. He still summoned his heir, the future Philip III, and prepared him for rule. It is said that he believed his suffering was divine punishment, a purification before death. He surrounded himself with relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, blessed icons from across Christendom. He kissed them with cracked, bleeding lips. He listened to masses read at his window. Too weak to rise, but not yet dead. He asked his priests if his agony had meaning, and they told him yes, this was God's fire, burning away sin. And he accepted it, because to do otherwise was to go mad. But how long can a man suffer before even faith begins to shake? That is the question Philip II forced the world to ask. Each day, he should have died, and yet he lived. His spine became visible through an open wound on his back. His legs oozed fluid through split skin. His face, once regal, collapsed into a hollow skull, and still he lived. For 53 days, the empire held its breath, praying not for a miracle, but for an end. Ambassadors wrote home in disbelief. The king is dying. They said, the king cannot survive the week. But the week passed. Then another. Then another. This was no longer just the death of a man. This was the death of a myth. The idea that kings, anointed by God, were somehow protected from the cruelest aspects of mortality. Philip's body, crawling with maggots, reeking with rot, proved otherwise. Power had no meaning here, nor did wealth, nor bloodline. Only flesh remained, and flesh, always, must rot. This was how the century ended, not with glory, not with triumph, but with a groan from a bed in a darkened chamber where the sun never set on the empire, but did. Finally, on its king. It began in the quiet way. Most terrors begin not with a scream, not with a warning, but with something small, something that could be ignored. A sore, one sore, barely more than a bruise on the skin of a man who had spent too many weeks in bed, a man who could no longer rise without pain, who no longer walked, who no longer commanded his body. Philip II, ruler of the greatest empire of his age, had already become a prisoner of his own flesh by the time the first wound opened. And when it did, he looked at it with the kind of calm that only decades of control and devotion could summon. He prayed. He asked for ointment. He trusted in the physicians, who murmured assurances as they applied their poultices and whispered Latin prayers. But underneath their breath, they did not speak of healing. They spoke of how it looked deep, how the edges were already blackened, how the skin resisted pressure like a fruit too long in the sun. By that summer of the year, 1598, the king's body was no longer his own. His legs had begun to swell with fluid until the skin cracked open and oozed. His joints throbbed with the weight of gout, a condition that struck the noble and the wealthy with cruel irony. freezing their power inside, aching limbs. His appetite had faded. His nights were fevered. He could not turn in bed without the help of 4 men. And every movement left behind a trail of groans and damp sheets. And yet, even then, he remained conscious. Even then, he dictated state business. Even then, he prayed with a voice as steady as ever. Because Philip was not a man who surrendered, not to foreign enemies, not to heresy, and certainly not to illness. But illness does not need permission. It creeps. It waits. And when it finds a home, it makes itself king. The sore did not heal. Another appeared on his hip, then on his lower back, and then along the edges of his thighs where flesh met linen and pressure never relented. The physicians recognized the danger. They tried bleeding him again, letting blood from his arms and legs in the hope that this would balance the humors. They applied salves made from herbs ground fine as ash, soaked in vinegar, then warmed in cloth before pressing them to his wounds. They called in monks to pray more frequently. They washed the sheets with stronger soaps. They rotated the king as best they could. But the sores grew, each one wider than the last, more reluctant to close, more eager to sink. And then came the moment that no one in the chamber would ever forget, not the youngest page, not the oldest monk, not even the king himself. It was near the end of July. In the sweltering, breathless heat of the Escorial Palace, the king had been moved to his private chamber, the one with the small window that overlooked the chapel, where he had attended Mass in healthier years. He insisted on being able to see the altar, even from bed, and as he lay there, wrapped in damp linens, eyes watching the golden host being raised toward heaven, something began to move, not in the world outside, not in the faces of the priests, but beneath the dressing on his thigh. A twitch, then another, a slow, rippling squirm beneath the cloth. At first the physician thought it was a spasm, some muscle struggling for breath. But when he peeled back the linen and leaned close, what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was not flesh that moved. It was life. New life. Hungry life. Larvae. Pale and slick, writhing in the wound as though it were not a wound at all, but earth after a rainstorm. The bedsore had become a nest. Flies, drawn by the scent of death, had laid their eggs in the king's body. And now, with the king still very much alive, they hatched. The physician did not scream. He did not gasp. He only whispered to a nearby page to fetch a new cloth. And from then on, no one looked at the king's wounds the same way again. Each dressing change became a ritual, not of healing, but of horror. The maggots were removed, one by one, using silver tweezers heated over candles. But for each one taken, another was found hours later. The linens soaked through with blood, pus, and something else. Now, something wet and crawling. The sores had opened so deep that in some places, you could see the gleam of bone beneath the soft rot of skin. One of the king's attendants later confessed, in a journal not meant to be read aloud, that he had seen the king's spine laid bare through a wound in his lower back, and that he had never again been able to sleep without seeing it in his dreams. Philip knew. Of course he knew. He could feel them. Not always. Some of the nerves had gone numb, but sometimes, when they shifted in a certain way, when they burrowed just enough to touch living flesh, he felt the sting of being eaten alive. He asked if it meant anything. He asked if this was God's test. His confessors said yes. They told him he was suffering as Christ had suffered. They told him it was sanctification, that his pain had a purpose, that his body would fail, but his soul would shine. And he believed them, because what else was there to believe? That he was being consumed, for no reason at all. The stench became unbearable. No amount of incense could cover it. The servants began rotating every few hours, unable to withstand more than brief exposure to the royal chamber. Cloths, soaked in lavender and myrrh, were tied beneath their noses. The windows remained shut to keep flies out, but the heat made the air thick and wet. The king's sheets were changed several times a day, though each change left him crying out in pain. His body too fragile to move, his wounds too wide to lift without tearing. The maggots returned again and again, laid in new wounds, in old crevices, in places no man should have to endure. His daughters visited, silent and pale. His heir, Philip III, knelt beside the bed with trembling hands, but no one could stop what had begun. The king's body was now battlefield, temple, and tomb, and it was only the beginning. The first lesions were not the worst. The worst had not yet come, but even now, the king had entered the valley of shadow, and there was no path back, only forward, only deeper. And so the empire held its breath, and the chamber darkened, and the maggots fed. There are stories of kings whose deaths were glorious, whose last words became legend, whose final breath was taken surrounded by courtiers kneeling in reverence, and whose bodies were laid out with splendor as symbols of divine favor. But the story of Philip II did not belong to that world of poetry and painted ceremony, because his death unfolded not with solemn dignity, but with a slow, living decomposition that stripped away every illusion of royal majesty and left in its place only the raw, unbearable truth of mortality. And at the center of that truth, crawling without rest, without remorse, without the slightest pause for honor or prayer, were the worms. They did not sleep. They did not wait for death. They came while the king still breathed, while his lips still moved in prayer, while his eyes still tracked the flickering candlelight of relics passed over his chest. And as each night passed and each wound widened and the smell deepened, it became impossible to deny that the royal bed had become not just a place of agony, but a feeding ground, a place where the sacred met the obscene, where the flesh of the Lord's anointed served as nourishment for flies and their offspring. A reversal so profound that even the most pious attendants began to wonder silently what it meant, what it proved. What kind of test could last this long and hurt this much? The maggots were everywhere. They nested in the wounds along the king's back, where the pressure ulcers had opened to the bone. They gathered in the hollows of his groin, where moisture collected and dressings failed to hold. They squirmed under the folds of his swollen legs, bloated with dropsy, until the skin split and fluids seeped unchecked. And they returned again and again, no matter how many were removed, no matter how many prayers were chanted, no matter how much ointment was smeared into the putrefaction. Because the truth no one dared to say aloud was that there was no stopping them. Not without stopping the breath that still fluttered in the king's chest. And so the rituals of removal became daily theater, performed for the illusion of control, of intervention, of hope. The physicians labored without sleep, driven less by conviction than by desperation. And as each hour passed, their treatments grew more frantic, caustic pastes that burned the living tissue along with the dead. Cloths soaked in vinegar and salt. Leeches placed near the unbroken skin in a futile attempt to draw out the bad humors. And finally, when nothing else remained, incisions carved directly into the king's legs to release the fluid that swelled his limbs until the skin tore. But each cut each drop of blood, each moment of hope was met with the same result. More rot, more pain, more larvae crawling forth from the places no man should have to endure being wounded. And all the while Philip watched, lips trembling, but voice steady, asking not for death, but for patience. The smell had by now escaped the chamber. It seeped through the thick stone corridors of El Escorial, slipped past the tapestries and the velvet drapes, drifted beneath the doors of courtiers and ministers who came to attend to state matters only to find themselves gagging before reaching the king's wing. And there were whispers. Of course there were whispers. That this was a sign. That the king's soul was already slipping into purgatory, or worse. That the corruption of the body was the reflection of some hidden sin. And though the priests fought such rumors with sermons and incense, there was no denying what even the most loyal servant could smell. Philip II, the man whose orders had once reshaped continents, now lay in his own reek, his body decaying in real time. And the only thing louder than the rustling of his sheets was the silence of those who no longer had anything to say. The court tried to carry on, because imperies do not pause, not even for dying kings. And so ambassadors still arrived, and were received by ministers who lied politely about the sovereign's health. Missives were written in careful Latin phrases that softened the truth into phrases like His Majesty continues to persevere or the King receives comfort in prayer. But behind those phrases lay the knowledge that no one knew when the end would come, or whether the end would come at all, because it seemed that Philip was suspended in a state not meant to exist, somewhere between life and death, still aware, still dictating instructions for succession, still signing royal documents with a trembling hand while maggots fed beneath the ink-stained cuffs of his linen sleeves. Even those who served him daily began to fracture under the weight of what they saw. One young valet, assigned to change the king's sheets, reportedly collapsed after removing a bloodied bandage and glimpsing a colony of worms nesting beneath the king's left thigh. And though he was removed quietly and the matter never spoken of again, others began to ask, softly at first, to be reassigned, to be allowed to return to distant postings or to monasteries where the air did not carry the smell of human ruin. But the court would not permit such desertions easily. For to leave the king now was to commit a political and moral offense. And so many remained, their faces pale, their hands trembling, their faith tested not by heresy or warfare, but by the sight of their sovereign's suffering. And still, Philip endured. He did not scream often. He did not beg for release. He spoke of God's will, of eternal reward, of the sufferings of Christ. And though sometimes, in the late hours of the night, attendants reported hearing him weep softly, or murmur questions to the dark, why must I still live? What remains undone? He never openly cursed his fate. And perhaps that was the most terrible thing of all. For had he raged, had he collapsed into madness, had he given up his composure, there might have been some relief in it. Some sign that the ordeal was finally breaking the will that had ruled an empire. But instead, he remained a king, even in disintegration, clinging to dignity, in a place where dignity had no place left to hide. By the middle of August, the worms no longer surprised anyone. They were expected, a part of the daily cycle. As natural now as prayer or pain or fever, they were removed in handfuls. They returned in droves. No treatment worked. No holy relic drove them away. Even the priests began to lower their eyes when they offered blessings, as if fearing that the very sight of the body beneath the sheets might shake their faith beyond repair. The stench had become a second presence in the palace, a ghost, a curse, a prophecy filling the corridors like incense turned sour. And those who breathed it felt changed, marked, reminded that no matter how many crowns a man wore, no matter how many titles or saints or cathedrals he claimed, he was still made of flesh, and flesh always returns to dust. Sometimes too slowly, sometimes while the soul is still watching. And so the days passed, not in silence, but in whispers and the wet sound of wounds being redressed, in the creaking of the royal bed as 4 servants tried to shift a swollen, broken body without making him cry out, in the soft murmurs of nurses counting the worms they had removed that morning and wondering aloud how many more could possibly remain. And through it all, the king, the empire, the worms, and the smell endured, locked together in a slow descent from which no prayer, no physician, no air could deliver them. It was a room built to reflect divine order, designed not for comfort, but for discipline, not for luxury, but for sanctity, not for a king to die in, but for a king to live in constant awareness of God. That room, tucked within the heavy stone silence of El Escorial, had been chosen by Philip II as the physical heart of his faith. A narrow chamber, with a single window that faced the altar of the basilica, where the host was lifted during Mass, where relics were displayed, and where the most sacred rituals unfolded. From that window, the dying monarch could see the very mysteries he had devoted his life to defending, could watch the elevation of the Eucharist, even as his flesh fell away. I could listen to the echo of prayers he had once joined with a clear voice, now rasping in the back of a throat too dry to swallow. But that sacred room, by the late summer of the year 1598, had become something else entirely, a shrine not to holy grace, but to suffering, a battlefield, not of souls but of skin, and a prison of smells so thick they clung to the lungs like rot clings to wet wood. The moment one entered that room, breath ceased to be a natural act. The air did not carry the gentle musk of incense alone, nor the crisp coolness of mountain wind that sometimes slid in through the narrow crack of the high window, but instead hung heavy with layers of odor, the sharp sting of vinegar-soaked cloths, the metallic tang of blood, the wet mildew of sweat-drenched linens, and beneath it all, the deeper, denser stench of necrotic flesh, flesh no longer alive but not yet dead, flesh that had become so saturated with infection, with maggot burrows, with the leaking pus of opened ulcers, that it exhaled its own presence into the very walls of the chamber. The scent did not fade. It grew. It settled into fabric, into floorboards, into the very robes of the monks who passed through it. They burned incense in iron censers day and night, swinging them in circles, filling the corners with smoke, whispering Latin prayers as clouds of perfume tried in vain to cloak what was now inescapably a room of death, long before death had come. And yet, the prayers never stopped. They never stopped, day and night. In shifts, so carefully arranged, they mirrored the rhythm of monastic choirs. Priests and monks stood by the king's bed, reading from Psalms, from the book of Job, from Lamentations, reciting the litany of the saints, invoking Mary, St. James, Christ crucified, all in the hope that the pain that racked the king's body might be sanctified, that the torment might have meaning, that God, in his mercy, might turn his face toward the monarch who had built this fortress of devotion. And the king listened. He listened through the haze of fever. He listened while worms chewed his skin. He listened while his knees cracked and his stomach bloated. Sometimes he repeated the words in a whisper. Sometimes he asked for more. He demanded that the Gospels be read again. He asked for his favorite relics, the thorn from Christ's crown, the bone of a martyr, the splinter of the true cross, and kissed them with lips dry and splitting. He asked for candles to be lit. Not for light, but for symbolism. He wanted flame. He wanted presence. He wanted something holy in the room, even if it could not overpower the smell. And it could not, because holiness, however strong, was no match for the scent of human rot. It could not mask the filth, nor could it cleanse the linens faster than they were stained, nor stop the bleeding, nor drive away the flies that still found their way in despite the sealed windows and guarded doors. There was a moment recorded by one of the servants when the relics themselves were removed for a time. Not because of blasphemy, but because the odor had become so overwhelming. The cloths that wrapped the sacred items had become soaked in the same sweat that drenched the king's body. And even objects that had once touched the feet of saints could not withstand the tide of decay. The servants who remained in that room became something less than human and something more than loyal. They stopped speaking of sleep. They stopped speaking of time. They lived by the rhythm of the king's breathing when it was steady. They prayed for mercy when it stuttered. They waited for death. They changed his bandages, not to heal him, but to delay the spread of worms. They turned him gently, not to give comfort, but to keep one side of his body from merging completely with the mattress. They dabbed his forehead, not to soothe fever, but to clear the sweat that carried the smell. And when they left the chamber, they did not speak of what they had seen. They only vomited in the stone corridors, wiped their faces, and returned. Even his family came rarely now. His son, Philip III, stood silent at the foot of the bed, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with the kind of fear that only a son feels when the great figure of his life has become a mirror of what he might become. His daughters came, their visits short, their voices trembling, their prayers spoken with the urgency of those who wished they believed more strongly. No one could stay long, not even blood. The room resisted visitors the way the body resists poison too much, and something inside collapses. And so the king was left, more often than not, with priests who would not flinch, with monks too obedient to run, and with a handful of servants whose souls were being marked forever by what they saw each day. No one spoke of the king's face anymore. No one spoke of his hair, once carefully groomed, now damp and tangled. No one mentioned the blisters that had begun to rise around his mouth, nor the way his hands, once strong enough to sign decrees that moved fleets and armies, now curled like wilted petals. The skin stretched thin and gray. The room had consumed his image, leaving only the sound of his breath, the scent of his wounds, the trembling of candlelight on faces too tired to weep. This was not a deathbed. This was not a chamber of transition. This was a place outside of time, outside of hope, outside of medicine. And yet the rituals continued, because rituals were all that remained. The prayers, the songs, the incense, the processions of relics, they continued. Not because anyone believed they would heal the king, but because without them, the room would have nothing left but the smell. And if that smell became the only thing inside those walls, then faith itself might dissolve. And no one, not the church, not the court, not the people of Spain, I could afford to believe that their king was dying for nothing. And so they continued. And the king remained, and the sacred room where no one could breathe became, day by day, the final church of a man who believed that, through pain, one might be purified, even as his body proved otherwise. There comes a point when the distinction between healing and torture ceases to exist, when the effort to preserve life becomes indistinguishable from the act of prolonging death. And that point arrived for Philip II in the final weeks of the summer of the year 1598. The king who had once commanded fleets and built cathedrals was now a patient lying upon a bed that had become a crucible. Every day, the physicians, desperate and trembling beneath the weight of royal expectation, performed their rituals of medicine, rituals that belonged not to the science of healing, but to the faith of suffering. They believed they were saving him. They believed that pain was proof of life. They believed that to stop trying was to commit treason against both king and God. And so, each morning, they came armed with knives, with leeches, with bowls of boiling water, and with the unshakable conviction that if the flesh could be made to bleed, then perhaps it could be made to live. The king endured it all. He was too weak to resist, too devout to refuse, and too conscious to escape into mercy. They began by reopening the wounds that had begun to close over the larvae, slicing through layers of dying skin to expose the infection beneath. They called this cleansing. Though the process was nothing short of mutilation, the blade would pass through tissue so soft that it barely offered resistance, and from each new incision came the smell of putrefaction, the hiss of escaping gas, the bubbling of trapped fluid that had no place to go. The assistants held the king's limbs still, their hands shaking, their faces pale, as the physicians inserted metal tubes into the swollen flesh to drain the liquid that swelled his legs until the skin glistened like wax. The fluid, when it came, was thick and yellow and steaming, and with it came new waves of agony that sent the king's voice to the ceiling in cries that sounded less like words than like prayer turned to smoke. When the incisions were made, they placed cloths soaked in burning vinegar and herbs against the open wounds, hoping to kill the worms and cleanse the rot. The effect was immediate and terrible. The king would arch against the bed, his fingers gripping the sheets until the nails tore loose. His eyes rolled back, his mouth open in a sound that was half scream and half breath. They would hold him down, murmuring the name of Christ, and then continue, as if the invocation itself excused the cruelty. The worms that did not die were plucked out with silver tweezers heated in flame. The smell of singed flesh filled the chamber, and even the priests, hardened by weeks of this spectacle, turned their faces away. Yet Philip did not faint. His mind clung to consciousness, as if the act of witnessing his own torment was the final duty of his reign. He wanted to die awake, to see it through, to master it, as he had mastered everything else. But no man can master decay. They bled him again, for bleeding was the old remedy for all imbalance. And so the leeches were brought and placed along his thighs, his neck, even his temples, their slick bodies clinging greedily to royal blood that had already been thinned by fever and starvation. The sight of them disturbed even the most stoic attendants, creatures feeding upon a man already being eaten by others. But the physicians believed that if they could draw out the bad blood, the humors might realign and health might return. The leeches swelled, fell off, and were replaced. And when they were gone, the wounds they left became new gateways for infection. The very cure became the disease, but still they continued. For there was no other way to act, no other belief to hold. By now, the king's body had ceased to resemble anything human. His legs were columns of swollen, oozing meat, and his back an unbroken ulcer that reached from his shoulders to his hips. his sides covered in sores that bled and closed, and bled again. The skin of his abdomen stretched so tight with retained fluid that it shone like a lantern in the dim candlelight. When they cut him there to relieve the pressure, what poured out was not life, but a slow river of corruption, pus, blood, and something darker still, something that smelled of graves. The servants whispered that no mortal should live in such a state. The priests whispered that his endurance was divine. But there was nothing divine in that room anymore. Only the relentless sound of suffering echoing against the cold walls of El Escorial. Through it all, Philip prayed. He prayed not for release, but for purpose. He asked that his agony might serve as a bridge between his sins and salvation. He asked that God forgive the wars he had waged, the men he had condemned, the empires he had ruled with iron. He begged to believe that his torment was a cleansing, a holy purgation of flesh before the purity of death. The priests encouraged him, feeding his endurance with visions of paradise. They told him that pain was proof of grace. They told him that Christ's wounds had bled the same way. And perhaps he believed them, because belief was the only thing left that could make sense of what his body had become. Outside the chamber, life continued with the mechanical rhythm of empire. Messengers still rode from Madrid, delivering sealed reports to a ruler who could no longer sit upright. Ministers still debated policies in low voices, pretending that the king's mind, sharp as ever, could still direct the machinery of a realm, and the people prayed. Though not all prayed for recovery. Some whispered that God himself had turned away, that this suffering was judgment, not sanctification, that the man who had built cathedrals and burned heretics was now paying the price for confusing the two. But no one dared to speak such thoughts aloud within the palace walls. Inside, the physicians worked by candlelight. Each day a repetition of pain. They cut. They drained. They burned. They cleaned. They wrote notes with trembling hands, documenting every detail in the hope that they might learn something from it. Though what lesson could be drawn from a body that refused to die was beyond comprehension. One wrote that he had seen the king's wounds pulse as if they were alive. Another claimed that the worms emerged not just from the skin, but from the mouth, crawling over his beard and down onto his chest. Whether truth or exaggeration, it did not matter. The room had crossed the boundary between the physical and the infernal Seth. It was no longer a sick room. It was a living tomb. And yet the king lived. He lived through each incision. He lived through each night of fever. He lived through each sunrise that cast light across the bed, where he had ceased to be a man and become an object lesson in endurance. The priest told him it was because God had chosen him for a higher test. The physicians whispered that it was because his heart was too strong to fail. The servants believed it was because he was too afraid to die. But no one could deny the truth that hung in the air. The treatments meant to save him had only made him suffer more deeply. And yet he insisted they continue. He commanded it. He told them that the body must obey the soul. Even in death, he believed he could conquer corruption through faith and will of foreline. But corruption does not yield. It only consumes. By the time the first chill of September touched the mountains, the king's body was a ruin. The worms had returned in greater number than before. The incisions had become caverns. The smell had grown so strong that no servant could last an hour without fainting. The priests performed masses in shifts, their voices hoarse, their eyes hollow, and still the treatments went on. Still the knives were sharpened. Still the cloths were soaked in vinegar and laid across wounds that no longer responded. Still the man beneath the sheets whispered prayers between moans. His lips cracked, his eyes sunken, his breath rasping like a forge that refused to go out. This was the price of faith. This was the cost of devotion to medicine without understanding. This was the moment when healing became cruelty sanctified by obedience. And yet in that darkness, beneath the rot and the fever and the endless sound of his own breathing, Philip II clung to life as though the mere act of surviving could redeem him. As though endurance itself was proof that his reign, his power, his soul had not been for nothing. But the flesh would not heal. And the flesh did not forgive. There is a mercy in madness. A veil that falls when pain becomes too much. When the mind can no longer bear the weight of the body's screams. When the soul retreats into silence or delusion. But for Philip II of Spain, that mercy never came. And that silence never fell. Because through all the agony, through every sleepless night and each wretched dawn, through every scream muffled behind clenched teeth, his mind remained awake, clear, and cruelly tethered to every hour of his unending disintegration. He could not sleep. Not truly. He could not drift. Not fully. His body had begun to rot, but his mind would not let go. And in this unholy division of soul from skin, of spirit, from ruin, he lived far longer than he should have, and suffered far more than any soul should be asked to endure. By the first days of September in the year 1598, the king's condition had entered a phase so unnatural, so grotesquely balanced between death and not death, that even the physicians stopped predicting when the end would come. It had become impossible to understand how he still lived, how he still spoke, how his eyes still opened each morning to gaze upon a world reduced to incense smoke, candle shadows, and the blurred outlines of priests reading the same scriptures over and over again. His body had become a husk, and yet within that husk, something refused to extinguish. His voice was hoarse, cracked, often no more than a whisper, but it gave commands. It asked for prayers. It repeated names of saints with the steady rhythm of a man who had surrendered everything but control over his own clarity. He spoke to his heir. He called for documents. He asked that treaties be reviewed. Ambassadors answered. Minister summoned. His fingers could no longer grip a quill. But he dictated with the precision of a man sitting in council, not rotting in bed. The notaries, who stood at the edge of the room wrapped in cloth to block the stench, took down every word, their eyes wide with the dread of it all. Not just the smell, not just the wounds, not just the sight of worms writhing in gauze, but the unnatural steadiness of a voice emerging from a mouth that had begun to ulcerate from the inside. A voice that did not tremble, even as the flesh from which it came had long since lost all shape. There were moments, in those endless nights, when attendants thought he had finally slipped away. His breath would falter, his lips would dry, his eyelids would flutter and close. And for a long hour, they would wait, motionless, breathless, hands folded over sacred texts. And then he would stir. He would ask what day it was. He would inquire whether the host had been elevated at Mass. He would request to be turned slightly, not to lessen the pain. There was no position that did not cause pain, but to face the window again, to see the altar, to glimpse that small reminder that something divine still existed outside his walls. And the servants would weep, not from joy, from exhaustion, from fear, from the terrible realization that death was not ready, and the king was not willing to fall into darkness. His priest told him he was like Job, like the martyrs, like Christ on the cross. They told him that his endurance was holy, that his pain was redemptive, and perhaps he believed them. Because if he did not, then all of it, the rotting, the mutilation, the worms, would mean nothing. He asked them once, in a rare moment when fever had broken and silence had filled the chamber, whether it was possible that his agony was punishment, not cleansing, not a test, but punishment. They told him no. They told him such thoughts were sin. But he asked again the next day, and the day after that, and slowly, as his body failed but his voice did not, as his wounds deepened but his words remained steady, those questions became more frequent. Had he offended God? Had he done wrong in the sight of heaven? Had he, in his hunger for order, for empire, for obedience, broken something sacred? He searched the air for answers. He searched the faces of the priests, but no answer ever came that truly satisfied the mind of a man who had ruled so long, and now found himself unable to rule even his own dying. There were nights when the king did not pray, not aloud, not with others. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight, and his breath ragged and shallow. And those who watched him saw something more terrifying than pain. They saw doubt. Not the loud doubt of a man cursing heaven, but the quiet, hollow doubt of someone wondering whether there was, in fact, anything left beyond the veil. Whether the saints were listening, whether all his faith, all his devotion, all his iron obedience to ritual and law had meant anything at all. And when he finally blinked and turned his face away from the altar, even for a moment, the priests rushed to his side, murmuring psalms, clutching relics, trying to pull him back from the edge of that abyss. And usually, he let them, but not always. Sometimes he stayed quiet. Sometimes his eyes did not close in prayer, but stared, blank and open, into the middle distance, as if he saw something coming for him, something no cross or candle could hold back. Still, he lived. Each morning, the fever came and went. Each day, the wounds deepened. Each evening, he dictated another command. The servant spoke of how he remembered every name, every alliance, every oath. Even as his body turned black in patches, even as his abdomen grew so distended that they feared the skin would tear open and spill what remained of him onto the sheets. He remembered. The court outside waited. The empire waited. But Philip did not let go. He did not surrender. His body no longer served him, but his mind remained his kingdom, and he would rule it to the end. By the second week of September, the maggots had returned in numbers that defied belief. The physicians had stopped trying to remove them all. There were too many. They focused now on comfort, on sedatives, on herbs that dulled the nerves without putting him to sleep. Because sleep did not come naturally anymore. He had passed beyond it. He drifted. Yes, he closed his eyes. But true rest, the kind that heals, the kind that carries the soul to gentler shores, was denied him. His soul hovered between fire and sky, between guilt and hope, and the room around him, filled with the rustle of dying, had become a cathedral of waiting. He whispered confessions each day, even when no new sins had been committed. He confessed thoughts, dreams, fears. He confessed his fear of dying alone, of dying filthy, of dying unredeemed. And his priests told him that he would be lifted up, that all would be washed away. But even they could not hide their horror now. The pain had become too much. The light had become too dim, and the mind of the king, still razor sharp, still watching, still calculating, still believing, began to fray at the edges. Not into madness, but into exhaustion. And still, he lived. Because sometimes, the soul refuses to sleep, even when the body begs for release. Sometimes, a man's mind outlasts his blood. Sometimes, what remains is will. Bare, burning will. And it was that will that kept the king alive. But even will has limits. And they were near. There came a morning in mid-September of the year, 1598, when the walls of El Escorial trembled not from wind nor footsteps, but from the quiet realization that something was no longer holding, that something inside the king had finally begun to give way. And though the sky above Castile was clear and still, inside the sacred chamber, the air had thickened with dread, too dense to name. It began not with a cry or a gasp, but with a wet, soft sound that none who heard it would ever forget. A sound of something splitting open, something parting under pressure. And those nearest to the king's bed turned in silence and saw that his abdomen, long stretched tight, with retained fluid, had finally ruptured. The flesh had opened, not in a single clean wound, but in a wide, jagged split. A dark and glistening rupture from which poured the slow, steaming corruption of a body that had been dying for too long. The servants did not speak. They had no words. The physicians froze where they stood, their tools halfway lifted, their mouths parted in horror. For though they had drained the king before cut him, lanced him, pierced his limbs to release the poison, gathering beneath the skin, this was different. This was the body breaking itself, surrendering not to blade or prayer, but to inevitability. From the opening in the king's belly came a flow of pus, of blood, of foul-smelling liquid that soaked through the linens in seconds. A flood that hissed as it touched the air, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of final decay. And yet, even then, the king remained conscious. His breath came in ragged bursts. His eyes opened, and in the moments that followed, as the physicians rushed to slow the leak, as cloths were pressed, as towels were soaked and discarded, as candles were blown out by the frantic shuffle of motion, Philip II whispered a question to the monk nearest his side. "Has the altar been dressed for mass?" The monk, trembling, nodded. "Then let it continue," the king said, and he closed his eyes. But he did not die. Not yet. For death, it seemed, was still waiting. In the hours that followed, chaos was replaced by grim routine. The rupture was packed with cloths soaked in oil and herbs. The physicians worked with the precision of men no longer trying to save, only to contain. The worms returned quickly, drawn to the new opening, and the attendants were forced to pick them from the wound before the linens could be changed. Each movement caused the king to groan. Though even that was weakening, his voice had grown thin, his lips unable to fully form words, but he still responded to prayer. Still squeezed fingers placed into his own. He was awake. He was aware. He was enduring. Outside the chamber, the whispers began to circulate. The rupture had been witnessed by more than one servant. The story spread to the lower halls, to the outer courtyards, to the priests not allowed into the room, and from there to the nobles, the ministers, and finally to Madrid. The court held its breath. The ambassadors sent word home. "The king is dying." They wrote again, though they had written the same words for weeks now. "He will not survive the night." And still, each dawn brought the news. Philip lives. Philip breathes. Philip suffers. And Europe, which had once feared his armies and admired his piety, now stood still and waited for a monarch who had become legend, not through conquest, but through his refusal to die. The altar in the chapel below remained dressed. Masses were offered continuously. The monks chanted around the clock, their voices now hoarse from repetition. Their feet blistered from standing too long. Sacred relics lined the king's bedside bones. Nails, thorns, splinters of saints, all surrounding a man whose body had become something between holy and hellish. The priests anointed him again, though they had already performed the rite days earlier. They sprinkled holy water. They touched the cross to his chest, and they told him, again, that salvation awaited. But inside the chamber, no one could ignore the scent. It had grown unbearable, so thick that even those used to it, those who had stood watch for weeks now, felt themselves waver. The rupture had opened not only the flesh, but the air itself. The scent of rot was in the walls, in the hair, in the clothing of every man and woman who entered. It clung to them when they left. Some begged not to return. One servant collapsed and had to be carried out. Another was found weeping in the corridor. The linen closet was nearly empty. The candles burned too quickly. And yet, no one left. Because to leave now was to abandon a king who still breathed. Inside the king, the infection had moved beyond the skin. His kidneys had begun to fail. His lungs rattled with fluid. His mouth, dry and cracked, bled when he tried to speak. His stomach bloated again. Even after the rupture, his spine could still be seen through the open sores along his back. And the worms, once plucked and burned, were now allowed to remain. For there were too many, and the physicians no longer had the strength or perhaps the courage to remove them. And yet, he did not ask them to stop. Philip did not beg for death. He asked, instead, for silence. He asked that the prayers be whispered, not chanted. He asked that the candles remain lit. He asked that the window be opened, just enough, so that the scent of incense from the chapel below might reach him. He asked that no one say the word dying. And then, he asked for his heir, the young Philip, soon to become the third of that name, entered the chamber quietly. He stood at the foot of the bed. He bowed, and then he wept, not from grief alone, but from terror, for what he saw was not a father, but a prophecy, a vision of what kingship could become when the body refused the mercy of ending. Philip II opened his eyes, and though he could no longer lift his arms, he spoke with a clarity that silenced every man in the room. You must rule, he said, but do not rule like this. And then he closed his eyes again. The room did not move. The smell did not leave, and time itself seemed to pause, as if the kingdom were caught between two breaths, between a monarch who would not let go, and a son who was not yet allowed to rise. Outside, the bells of the chapel rang for evening prayer. Inside, the king still breathed. The wounds still wept, and the worms did not sleep. It began as any other night had begun during those long final weeks, with the soft scrape of sandals on cold stone, with the low chants of monks circling the altar below, with the sigh of candles burning low, and the silence of a court that no longer dared to speak above a whisper. But something in the air, on that 12th night of September, in the year 1598, felt different. As if the very walls of El Escorial, which had watched over this slow, impossible agony, had finally grown tired of the waiting. As if the hour that had been approaching for 53 days had at last stepped forward, slow and inevitable, cloaked not in trumpets nor thunder, but in the exhausted breath of a man who had run out of flesh. The king no longer moved, not from pain, for that had long since passed beyond measurement. And not from sleep, for he had not truly slept in weeks, but because even the small twitches of the hands, the flutters of the eyelids, the murmured prayers that had once crept between his cracked lips had now ceased, and what remained on the bed was not silence, but stillness, heavy and complete, the kind of stillness that makes grown men forget to breathe. His body, if it could still be called a body, lay swathed in linen, yellowed from fluid and darkened by blood that no longer ran but seeped. And the sheets beneath him were changed so frequently now that the laundry servants had stopped counting them. Yet no matter how many times they cleaned, no matter how many herbs they burned, no matter how many windows they opened or cloths they soaked in perfume, the room had passed beyond human tolerance. No one could touch him anymore, not because they lacked the will, but because the skin itself had begun to separate from the flesh beneath, pulling away in long, translucent layers, sliding from his limbs, like a veil unfastened from a corpse. And beneath it lay nothing but rot. When they attempted to move him, the attendants cried out not from his pain, which he no longer seemed to register, but from the horror of seeing the skin tear in their hands, of feeling the warmth of putrefaction pulse through the cloth as if the decay were alive. The physicians, who had spent the last 8 weeks performing treatments that blurred the line between medicine and punishment, now stepped back. They refused to cut. They refused to lance. They refused to leech. There was nothing more to bleed, nothing more to cleanse. The body had gone beyond their hands. And yet, still, he breathed. Not steadily, not strongly, but just enough. The room was dark now, lit by only a single candle kept near the relics that lined the far wall, the worn wooden cross from Toledo, the chipped bone of Saint Isidore, the sealed vial said to hold the blood of a martyr. They had been brought to comfort the king, to protect him in death. But now they stood untouched, their light dimmed by the smell that even the saints could not drive away. The priests remained in the chamber in shifts, reading from psalters that no longer registered in the king's ears, crossing themselves in patterns worn by repetition, trying to keep the rhythm of devotion alive in a room where everything else had died. The words fell into the air and were swallowed by it, as if the room itself no longer recognized language. One servant whispered that they should stop, that perhaps the words were keeping him here, that perhaps silence was the only gift left to give. But no one listened, because to stop praying was to admit defeat. And kings, like saints, must never be abandoned, even when God himself seemed absent. Philip had not spoken in nearly 2 days. His lips had cracked until they bled, then scabbed, then broke again. His eyes remained half open, glazed and sunken, the whites yellowed with sickness. His breath whistled through what was left of his nostrils. His throat, raw from vomiting blood, rasped each time air passed through it. His hands, once curled in devotion, now lay open at his sides. The fingers bloated and blackened at the tips. The worms had returned, not just in the wounds, but in the folds of his ears, the corners of his eyes, the hollow of his throat. No one removed them now. There was no longer a point. The hour was close. It passed midnight. The bells were not rung. No announcement was made. But one by one, those within the palace began to gather outside the king's chamber. They did not enter. They did not knock. They stood in silence, back straight, face espalda, waiting for the candle to be extinguished. Inside, the priests had ceased reading. They knelt instead. The silence was thick. filled only with the sound of the king's failing lungs. His son stood beside him, pale and motionless, his hand near the edge of the bed, not touching, just hovering, as if afraid to break the fragile membrane that separated father from ghost. He had already been crowned in the minds of the ministers. He had already been called king in the whispers of courtiers, but until that final breath left the body on the bed, he would remain a son. And a son does not breathe easily, while his father still suffers. And then, without warning, it stopped. There was no cry, no gasp, no final word, only the sudden, absolute absence of sound, a stillness deeper than the others. The candle flickered and went out. The priests crossed themselves in silence. The physicians stepped forward, their hands trembling, their eyes lowered, and placed 2 fingers against the king's throat. Nothing. They listened at his chest. Nothing. They waited a full minute. Then another. Then another. And then one of them whispered the words no one had dared to say for 53 days. The king is dead. Outside the chamber, the gathered court dropped to their knees. Some wept. Some closed their eyes. Some simply breathed for the first time in weeks. The news spread quickly, not by messengers, but by silence itself, filling the palace with the one thing that had never entered that room: release. But there remained the question of the body. No one could touch it. No one dared. The flesh was too far gone. The skin too loose. The rot too deep. There would be no public viewing. No. Royal vigil. The embalmers were summoned, but refused to do more than wrap the corpse in thick linens soaked in herbs and pitch. They did not dress him. They did not wash him. They sealed him in wood. Thick and plain. Faster than tradition demanded. The coffin was carried not with grandeur, but with fear. The burial was quiet. The stone slab at El Escorial was lowered into place before dusk. No trumpets. No crowds. Only silence. And a memory that would never be spoken in full. Because what had died on that final night was not just a king, but the illusion that kings do not die like other men. What remained was not legacy, nor ritual, nor sanctity, but the echo of a breath that had lasted too long, the stench of a body that could no longer be touched, and the whisper of a kingdom that had learned, through 53 days of agony, what power cannot prevent. Let us rest now, not just from the horror, not just from the long unraveling of one man's body, but from the weight of what it all meant. The story has ended. The king is dead. The worms are gone. The linens have been burned. The servants have been reassigned. The windows of that dark chamber have been thrown open. And fresh air, though late, and though unwanted, has returned to the halls of El Escorial. And yet, even now, centuries later, there remains a breath held somewhere in the silence, as if history itself is still trying to exhale what it witnessed, as if time, like us, is still trying to understand how a man so powerful, so holy, so prepared, could die in such a way. There are 2 stories told of King Philip II. One is written in gold and marble, in altars and cathedrals, in the groined vaults of his basilica and the statues of saints carved into stone by hands paid with imperial coin. In that story, he is the Catholic monarch who defended the faith, who governed with precision, who brought order to chaos and ruled an empire on which the sun never set. That Philip is still found in textbooks and ceremonies, remembered in portraits that smooth the lines of age and disguise the tremble of pain behind robes of velvet and crowns of jeweled certainty. But the other Philip, the one whose name no one speaks aloud, is the man we have walked with now. The man who spent 53 days being consumed by his own body while his soul remained trapped inside it. The man who was eaten alive by worms before the eyes of priests who wept and doctors who could do nothing but record. The man who died slowly, so slowly that it was not the moment of death that mattered anymore, but the long betrayal that came before it. The Philip who lay naked beneath relics and incense, whispering prayers that seemed to fall into a sky that never answered. And we must ask ourselves, softly, in the hush of this final hour, what did it mean? Because stories like this one are not remembered just for the gore. They are not retold simply because they horrify. They stay because they ask us to look at the thing we try most to avoid. Not just death, but the kind of death that removes dignity, strips away titles, tears down the illusion that power protects us, and lays bare the one truth that no crown can cover, that we are flesh, and that flesh fails. Philip II was not the first man to die in agony. He was not the last. But he was the only king whose death was documented in such appalling, suffocating detail, not because of how he ruled, but because of how long he took to die. And in that long dying, he became something that kings are not supposed to be: human. Unbearably, obscenely human. No pageantry, no myth. Just wounds that wept and skin that peeled and breath that would not stop until everything else had gone. We tell this story not to judge him, not to mock him, not even to pity him. We tell it because there is something in us, some quiet voice that grows louder in the dark, that needs to know what happens when the things we fear most are no longer distant, when death is not sudden, when pain is not brief, when faith is not rewarded, and when the people who seem untouchable are, in the end, touched in the cruelest way of all. We tell it because we, too, live in bodies. Because we, too, I believe that what we do in life might somehow earn us mercy in death. And because we, too, I wonder whether suffering means something, whether it cleanses or punishes, or simply is. Perhaps Philip wondered the same. During those long nights when no prayer could drown the sound of the worms, perhaps he believed, with all his soul, that his agony was holy. Or perhaps, in the last hour, when even his priests could no longer meet his eyes, he realized what many have realized at the end, that pain does not always purify, and that not every death is granted meaning. But still, he faced it. He did not rage. He did not flee. He did not ask to be spared. He stayed, awake, aware, present in the wreck of his own body, until the very last breath. And there is something in that, not triumph, not glory, but a kind of courage that is hard to look at. The courage to witness one's own ruin, to name it, and to remain within it. If there is a lesson to be found, perhaps it is this: that no title, no empire, no altar can prevent the body from failing, and that the greatest kings, like the smallest children, must eventually meet death, not in gold, but in silence. Philip was buried in El Escorial. Beneath the altar he had looked toward in those last weeks. His tomb is plain, dignified, sealed in stone. Tourists pass by it now, whispering his name, unaware of what he endured, unaware of what that small chamber above once smelled like, unaware that beneath their feet lies not just a monarch, but a question that history still cannot answer. And perhaps it is better that way. Perhaps the horror is not meant to be remembered in full. Perhaps it is enough to know that he endured, that he remained, that even as the body decayed, the will did not. Or perhaps, if we are honest, It is better that we remember it all, so that when we think of kings, we remember not just the crowns, but the flesh beneath them, so that when we think of death, we do not turn away, but sit with it a little longer, and so that when we think of ourselves, lying one day in some quiet room, we remember that what matters most in the end is not how we ruled, but how we stayed, how we faced it, how we let go. 53 days, 1,272 hours, 76,320 minutes. Every single one endured by a man who had once ruled half the known world. Every single one recorded. Every single one survived. Until, at last, he didn't. Sleep now. Let the candles go out. The king is dead. And at last, he is quiet.